I'm sitting on a plane. I've been sitting on a plane for quite some time. We boarded on time, you see, and everyone got into their seats, and we actually pushed back from the gate, and we started down the runway, and then we heard a sound that is the most dreaded sound that those who fly weekly ever hear. The sound of silence. The engines were turned off. And then there was a long pause. And finally, our pilot got on the intercom and he said, "We have a delay," which is something we all already knew. And he explained the reason for delay, all the ifs, ands, and buts about why we were still sitting there on the runway without our engines going and not knowing how long we would be staying there. And then we waited. It always seems like it's way longer than it is. And then, after what felt like 2 days of waiting, the sound came. It was the sound of the whir of the engine starting up. And all around, and our American Airlines pilot and everyone on the crew and every passenger on the plane gave it, the plane that is, a round of applause. And everybody checked their watch to see how long we were sitting there and about how long it would be before they got to their destination. This is a story that I lived for dozens of times during my years of travel. You know, sitting on an airplane that is actually flying isn't too bad. I mean, it's not the most comfortable seat in the world, mind you, but it's okay. But there's nothing as uncomfortable, in my experience, as sitting in an airplane seat when you're sitting still. It's rather cramped, and you don't want to be there, and you have to fasten your seatbelt, and you can't go anywhere. So it just isn't a very comfortable spot to be. It's always best to be on your way. In our story for today, Jesus went up to a mountain, and he was praying to find out when he was cleared for departure. He went up with Peter, James, and John, and he was praying and waiting for God to say, "You are cleared to depart." Listen with me for those words to Jesus and his disciples in Luke 9, starting with verse 28. Now, about 8 days after these things, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. And suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elisha, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighted down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he was saying. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things that they had seen. Our story for today is one of the most elusive and evocative images in the whole Gospel of Luke. We find Jesus up on a mountain, his face shining like the sun and his robes dazzling white. Jesus had gone up to the mountain to pray. And what was the subject of his prayer? His departure. Now, the word departure, both in Greek and in English, can mean a number of things. A departure can be like my departure from O'Hare that was delayed that one day. That is a departure to travel to another city. A departure can also mean a death. There was a departure in the Old Testament when the children of Israel were led by Moses across the Red Sea and went into the Promised Land. That also was a departure. Jesus had a departure coming up too, but his departure looked more like a trip to Jerusalem and across. But how was Jesus supposed to know this was the right time? This was the right flight. This was the right place for him to go. In all of the stories in Luke where Jesus is facing a major transition in his life, we find Jesus praying. He prayed when he was tempted. He prayed when he was baptized. He prayed when he went up into the mountain and was transfigured. And he prayed the night before he died in Gethsemane. And the subject of his prayer on this day was the same subject of his prayer at Gethsemane. It was his departure, his trip that was coming up, a trip to the cross. Now we know that Peter, James, and John had gone up that mountain all the way with Jesus and had reached the top, but it must have been a pretty tiring trip because once they got up there, they fell asleep. And while they were asleep, some amazing things started taking place. Jesus appeared on the mountain with Elisha and Moses. Now, Elisha and Moses had unusual departures in Scripture. Moses' death is somewhat unclear. We don't know exactly where he died, how he died. We don't know where he was laid to rest, but rabbis believe that Moses was translated directly up into heaven. And well, Elijah, even more dramatically, went straight to heaven in a chariot of fire. So here was Jesus standing with Moses and Elijah, talking about his departure. But his departure probably wasn't looking like it was going to be straight to heaven. He had a trip to make to Jerusalem and the cross. Now, Peter, James, and John woke up while Moses and Elijah were still standing there with Jesus. And Peter woke up enough, barely awake, but enough to notice who they were right away. And he was astonished. There they were up on top of the mountain. And there was Jesus and Moses and Elijah all shining so brightly. It must have been one of the most glorious things you could possibly imagine. And Peter said, in his usual way, let's build 3 dwellings up here. One for you, Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. We'll just stay right up here on top of this mountain. It is good to be here. Ah, yes, very good to be on top of that mountain. But just as Peter was saying that, a cloud came over, and they were in utter darkness, completely dark. And a voice came and said, "This is my beloved. Listen to him." And when they woke up fully and the cloud had cleared, only Jesus was there. Moses and Elisha were gone. So the disciples turned to Jesus and they walked down that mountain. We have to walk down mountains too sometimes. I'm told that people who climb Mount Everest, I'm not one of them. I would love to be able to do that, but I think the time has escaped me. People who do climb Mount Everest, though, apparently when they finally do get to the top of the mountain, they have to be talked down. Nobody wants to leave once they finally get up there. And it takes a whole month, you see, just to climb up that mountain. And it's a lot of work and a lot of agony just, camping out in that cold, cold weather and getting up every morning and walking just a little bit further until you finally get up to the top. And once people do, they want to stick around. Almost always the guides have to coach them down from the mountain. They don't know how tired they are when they're up there. They are running out of bottled oxygen. They're standing in the death zone. They've got to descend 2,000 feet just to get into the safety zone. And they don't understand that the hardest part of the trip wasn't going up. It was coming down safely without injury. Because almost everyone who dies on Everest dies on the descent, not the ascent. Well, I suspect the disciples were tempted too. Once they got to the top of that mountain, they saw all that wonderful glory. They wanted to stay. Who wouldn't? But Jesus wanted to go down. He had a departure, and he had to go. And they followed him. We are asked to do the same, all of us. We are asked to depart down the mountain, to listen to Jesus, to follow Jesus. We don't learn how to be faithful people by seizing upon the highest moment in our life and staying there. We don't learn to be faithful people by staying put where we are either. We learn faith by following Jesus and remembering that he knows where we have to go, because he has already gone there himself, and he can guide us all the way. And by remembering that, he leads us into green pastures and still waters and places that we can't even imagine. A few weeks before I started seminary, I had a dream. In the dream, I climbed a mountain. I was able to do something in the dream that I've never been able to do when I'm awake. It was a very long climb, up, 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 up the mountain. When I finally got to the top, I looked around, and it was the most spectacular thing I had ever seen in my life. And in that very moment, just as soon as I opened my eyes and I saw the scene, I was blind. I noticed there was a cane in my hand, in my right hand. It was one of those canes that people who are blind use. But that's all I had, and I couldn't see a thing. And I knew, because I had climbed up that mountain, just how steep it was, just how treacherous it was going up, and now I had to go down. And so I had that cane, and I was tapping around me, trying to find every nook and cranny so that I could put my foot just one more step forward. And then I sensed that there was someone beside me. And I heard a voice. And the voice said, "I can help you down that mountain. You can take my hand and I'll guide you." And I demurred. I wasn't really interested, to tell you the truth. I did have my cane after all. And I kept tapping and tapping and tapping. And the voice came to me again and said, "You know, if you travel with me, you're not going to have to be all by yourself going down the mountain. And I do know how to get down." And I knew that if I was going to take that hand, I was going to have to let go of that cane, which I did not want to do. But eventually, after some coaxing, I just let it go. And I could hear it cling, 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 down the mountain. You could just hear it disappearing. And I grabbed onto that hand, and I've never let go. And we're still going down the mountain together, Jesus and I. We will be for the rest of my days. Jesus guides me down the mountain because he knows how to get down, and I don't. And I can't keep going up anymore. I've already been up there. It was great, but I have to go down now. Jesus can guide you down any mountain that you have to descend, into any valley that you have to face. And he knows how to walk the way because he's already made the trip to Jerusalem and the cross. And if you have to make a trip to Jerusalem, you don't have to do it by yourself. You can drop your cane and you can grab that hand. That's how we all become faithful. Jesus wants to go with you, so you aren't alone. Will you come? Will you come and follow him?